the second panel of the day, of the second day of our conference, Captivity and Social Justice in Modern Italian Culture. We are coming to the closing roundtable. We were very pleased to see so many of you. And this afternoon I leave the mic to Matteo Brera, my colleague, who will be introducing the moderator of the panel, and then we'll take it from there with the roundtable. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Elena. Yeah, it is my pleasure to introduce the roundtable and in particular its chair and respondent, Loredana Polezzi, Professor Loredana Polezzi, who is Alfonso M. D'Amato Chair in Italian American and Italian Studies at in the Department of European Languages, Literatures and Cultures at Stony Brook University. She previously held positions in Italian and Translation Studies at the University of Warwick and Cardiff in the UK. Her research interests combine translation studies and transnational Italian studies. She has written extensively on Italian travel writing, colonial and post-colonial literature, translingualism, and migration. Her current work focuses on memory, mobility, and translation in transatlantic Italian cultures. She has a specialist interest in Italian American studies and in translation and the visual arts. She has, with Rita Wilson, she's co-editor of leading international journal, The Translator, and she is the current president of the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies. She was a co-investigator in the research project Transnationalizing Modern Languages and Transnationalizing Modern Languages Global Challenges, funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council under the Translating Cultures theme and Global Challenges Research Fund. She's one of the editors of the Transnational Modern Language series, book series published by Liverpool University Press. Today, as I said, Loredana will be our respondent and moderator of the roundtable Captivity, Borders and Race, which promises to bring up important matters, important topics, and foster a fantastic discussion around these pivotal themes, especially for today, and very, very timely ones indeed. So Loredana, I leave all the panelists, the roundtable participants, to your capable hands. Roundtable participants whom I want to thank again for having accepted our invitation at a really, really short notice. And I'll leave the floor to Loredana without any further ado.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you, Elena, first of all, for inviting me to host this final session. It's been an exciting conference, an incredibly illuminating conference. It's taken us through a variety of modes of mobility and immobility. It's taken us through historical periods and also very much into the present, and the present made of practices, experiences, and policies. And this final panel, this final roundtable, promises to take us further into many of these themes. We have 5 presentations and 6 presenters, and again, to remind everyone of the way that we're going to do this. So we're going to have all of the presentations, and the recommendation is to stay as close as possible. Like, how's that, Matteo? Will that do? As close as possible to 10 minutes, so that we have enough time at the end for what I'm sure will be a very lively discussion. So our first presenter is Antonio Morone, who is Associate Professor in Contemporary African History at the University of Pavia, where he also coordinates the Master in African and Asian Studies in the Department of Political and Social Sciences. He has written, and I'm sure many here know his work, he's written on colonial and post-colonial history in North Africa and the Horn of Africa, has worked on a variety of sources from archives to oral testimonies, and is currently also working on projects in this area. In his presentation, he will talk about the link between Italian containment and deportation policies at the end of World War II and today's externalization policies in Libya and more broadly in Africa. Antonio, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Elena and Matteo for inviting me. And thank you so much, Loredana, for your kind presentation. I would like just touch a couple of points that are related to the subject of captivity and internment in the Italian culture from a perspective of colonial and post-colonial studies. And I think that could be very interesting to link migration and colonialism in the Italian culture. So, as I'm sure that you know, maybe better than me, that the current discourse in Italy about migration from Africa is, you know, is very related to some words that I can summarize in danger, illegality. Usually the Africans that they coming from Africa are perceived like something that is out of control. Sometimes also people that they are reputed completely different from the Italian people. And of course, this issue is touching the racial issue. So because those people are black Africans, are represented as black, even when they are not in reality black. So since the very beginning of the 2000s, the Italian establishment was very active in promoting a quite complex pattern of containment and internal policies in Italy and also in Africa. So the so-called policy of repatriation, and the policy of prima accoglienza, the first reception, are in reality policies of refoulement and internment policies that are implemented, that were implemented, that are still implemented with the help of the Gaddafi and post-Gaddafi Libya, and also with the help of another handful of African states, especially Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Niger. So in my understanding, I think that these kind of policies could be described as a cycle of containment that is intended to foster a process of externalization and securitization of the Italian and European southern border into the Libyan soil. So not only in Italy, not only at sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, but also in Africa, in the Libya, especially in the Libyan soil. So basically, this cycle is producing not only the refoulement of migrants, but also the captivity of migrants, the internment of migrants in Italy and in Libya, and finally the deportation of migrants towards their home countries from Libya, but also from Italy. Of course, this issue is regarding the matter of rights of migrants. Is regarding also the matter of the international order, the responsibility of Italy, the responsibility of the European Union. But in my understanding is regarding also very clearly the connection between Italian colonial history and the present relations with African countries, and in Libya in particular. So the first point that I would like a little bit conceptualize is the issue of phantom border. So the containment cycle, as I said, was a process of externalization and securitization into the Libyan soil. So mostly in Libya, more than in Italy and more than in the sea, so in the Mediterranean Sea. This process is clearly overlapping and also in a way is re-establishing a hold border and a space that is closely related to the history of colonialism. So if you look at the history of Italian occupation in Libya, we have to underline that Italy was able during the 30s to divide the Libyan space in one part of the colony, the northern strip, the coastline of Libya that was reputed the useful part of Libya and was devoted to the policy of settler colonialism, and the rest of the Libya, basically the desert, that was reputed unuseful or at least less useful and was still under the military administration, the Italian military administration. So I think that there is a close connection between the nowadays relations between Italy and Libya, when Italy is clearly trying to control the northern strip of Libya, the coastline, for halting or preventing the departure of migrants, and is also utilizing the desert part of Libya for the major operation of imprisonment, detention, and deportation. So the reshaping of this divide in the Libyan space can be methodologically addressed in terms of phantom border or visibility of historical borders, which are no longer formal, of course, however, are still producing social and political effects for interaction. The phantom border is also the emotional and perceptual phenomenon of an external threat and an identity, internal identity. And this is very much the case of Italian and Libyan relations. So this is just to stress the point that the present policies of containment are rooted in the history of relation of the two states, but is not only in the relation between the states. They was rooted also in the relation between people, between Africans and Italians. And to prove that, I touched the second point that is related to the first, let me say, the first migratory chain that was linking Africa to Italy at the end of the Second World War. So in the middle of the 40s, there was some colonial subject that starting to travel to Italy, mostly from Libya and Eritrea, with the purpose to resettle, to stay in Italy and to have the opportunity to migrate to Italy for having a better life. Basically, those people were former intermediaries, so people that were used to work with the Italian or to work for the Italian in the colonial administration. For example, many of those people was former Askaris, so former colonial soldiers, that they traveled to Italy with this idea to stay in Italy because in Africa, the Italian Empire was over, and the new colonial occupation of the United Kingdom was something that was not so profitable like the relation with the Italians. So the change of regime in Africa was pushing those people to travel, to try to migrate to Italy. Usually they travel in an illegal way, as today, and they try to resettle in Italy. So from the Italian side, the first reaction was very similar to nowadays policies of containment, because the Italian authorities of the new Italian Republic decided to basically to intern all those colonial subjects in some military bases, and then to promote their enlistment in a special corps of the Italian army. So basically the idea was that the military service became the instrument to monitor and to discriminate the subjects that were not allowed to freely move throughout the Italian territory. On the opposite side, on the side of those colonial subjects, the vision was completely different, of course. Those people were clamoring to be Italian Africans, and consequently to have their right to stay in Italy and to live in Italy. The real end of this history is not an happy end, because almost all the colonial subjects were forcibly returned to Africa by the end of 1950, and very few colonial subjects were allowed to stay in Italy. Was just in some very exceptional cases. So evidently the Italian people and Italian authorities, they conceptualize their relation with this colonial subject in a very close way with the former colonial environment, with the colonial culture, with the previous colonial culture. For the Italian, at the end of the Second World War, those people, they are still colonial subjects. They are still Africans, and so for this reason, they have to stay in Africa, and not they are not allowed to stay in Italy. So the self-declared Italianness of the Libyans and the Eritreans was considered an absurdity, something wrong, and in contrast to the colonial order that was shaping not only the relation between Italians and Africa in Africa, but also in Italy. So in conclusion, I just would like to draw your attention to this very simple, but I suppose important point, that the present policies of containment has a very clear genealogy that is related to the history of colonialism, and above all is related to the end of the colonial domination, the Italian colonial domination over Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you for sticking to time. You had 12 minutes, which is what we said was the upper limit. So congratulations for that. And we'll move swiftly on, but we will return, I'm sure, to a lot of these topics. And I can already see links, for instance, the concept of border will return, I'm sure, again. And you were talking about questions that were very close also to notions of social harm and semiology that we will return to later. So I can see lines developing here already. So our second presentation is going to be by Valeria Castelli and Giulia Sbaffi. They're both at New York University. So Valeria Castelli is an instructor at New York University. She has been in the past visiting research scholar at the Solberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School, and also postdoctoral research fellow at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard, and she's held a number of other positions. Her work concentrates on socially engaged documentary filmmakers and how they deal with climate and mobility injustice, social inequality, and racism. Her co-presenter, Giulia Sbaffi, is a PhD candidate in Italian studies at New York University, and her dissertation focuses on the politicization and the cultural representation of sex labor in Italy through oral histories and interviews with sex workers. She's a member of the Archivio delle Memorie Migranti and also of the Italian Association of Oral History. And today they're talking to us about Waiting as Captivity, a reading of postcolonial practices of domination over migrants' lives through film. Again, over to the two of you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you to Elena and Matteo for inviting us. So today in our presentation, Giulia and I would like to discuss Waiting. Waiting is a short film made by Dagmawi Mer, who is an Ethiopian refugee and filmmaker who has been living in Italy since arriving to Lampedusa in 2006, after a long journey across the Libyan desert and the Mediterranean Sea. And also Waiting is made by Sharam Khosravi, who is an Iranian exile and professor of social anthropology at the University of Stockholm. This experimental film, which was released last year, integrates an academic reflection on the relationship between waiting and migration with the stories of migrants in order to reach a broader audience.
Valeria, can I just say there's some interference with your sound, and I don't know if it's your mic or if someone else has got their mic open. So could I ask everyone to keep their sound off during the presentation? But let's try again. Carry on. We were hearing you, but it was a bit of interference.
If there's still interference, I can try to take my headphones.
Have a go. If I give you the thumbs up,
okay,
you're fine.
Please tell me. Please.
Try with that. Okay.
So Giulia and I consider this film illuminating for a discussion of captivity and migration, given that making people wait, as Pierre Bourdieu writes, and I quote, is an integral part of the exercise of power, end of quote. And this is precisely what this film deals with, waiting as an instrument of domination, power, and control over migrants. In Imer Khosravi's film, we see the mechanism and consequences of this politicized waiting through the story of Salif Keita, a former school teacher from Burkina Faso who crossed the Mediterranean in 2014. After arriving in Italy, Keita started working as a fruit picker in agricultural regions of both southern and northern Italy. Imer met Keita in Saluzzo in Piedmont and began documenting with his camera the precarious conditions in which he was living and the discrimination he was enduring. As shown in Waiting, Keita and other migrant farm workers from Africa live in a place that they call Guantanamo. Here, as Imer's camera shows us, they live in overcrowded tents with no running water and electricity and with poor sanitary measures. When Keita first arrived to this place, he was shocked by what he saw. As he says, it was as if a natural disaster had just happened and a massive amount of people had been placed in emergency housing. Every corner was full. I was almost too late, says Keita. Even though this is not explicitly addressed in Waiting, migrant farm workers' labor in agriculture in Italy is managed by caporali, who usually act as intermediaries between migrants, farmers, or traders, and organized crime networks. Caporali exploit migrants' precarious condition, and in most cases their illegal status, and maintain control over them with violence and threats. As detailed by the Osservatorio Placido Rizzotto in their reports on agromafia, the illicit activities of organized crime in the agricultural sector, and caporalato, in 2014, which is the year when Imer and Keta met, caporali illegally enlisted 400,000 undocumented farm workers, mainly from Africa, of whom 100,000 lived in slavery-like conditions in shelters with no running water and sanitation. 70% of these workers received a daily payment of 25 to 30 euros for an average of 12 hours a day of work with no breaks, and had to pay for their transportation, food, and water. Farm workers also often had to pay for the shanties in which they lived. More recently, in 2018, 39% of agricultural workers had no formal contracts or official paperwork, and the number of farm workers illegally working for caporali were between 400,000 and 430,000. And many of them were living in a condition of great vulnerability. The COVID-19 pandemic has further enhanced migrants' precariousness. In 2010, out of the 680,000 migrants and refugees present in Italy, up to 500,000 worked as farm laborers, and around 40% of them had no proper contracts, no legal protection, and no health insurance. In Waiting, Keta is filmed as he writes a letter to his son, who is in Burkina Faso, and reads them as we hear through the voiceover. Keta says that his life in the tents, like the one of other migrants, is coming to an end and that he will move to Naples. But he's waiting to be paid. Others, we can imagine, might be waiting to obtain asylum or a resident permit. Some others might be forced to prolong their life in the tents and fall prey to injustice and exploitation because they have no papers. According to recent data in Italy, the average waiting time for asylum seekers to know if asylum has been granted to them or if they need to leave the country can be up to 1,000 days. The waiting time for non-EU foreigners to receive or renew their resident permits is 300 days, despite current legislation fixing the limit to 60 days. In Waiting, illustration by Marco Paci evoked this displacement as dispossession of time by drawing, for example, a human figure that runs in the dark towards a door with a paper in his hand, or a giant hand that seems to be throwing away a paper while a migrant stands before it. In the letter to his son, Keta stresses how different his life is from the one he had once envisioned. Europe is not the El Dorado as we thought, Keta tells his son, and adds, I would not want this rotten life to be part of your future. While Keta's displacement leaves him with little to no control on his own future, writing these letters to his son is a way for him to bear witness to his own and other migrants' suffering, violence, but also acts of resistance and awareness for future generations. Your future is in your hands, Keta tells his son. At the same time, through this narrative device of filming Keta as he writes, Khosravi and Imer allow him to represent himself and use his own voice to tell his story of migration. By so doing, Keta becomes both interviewer and interviewee, object and maker of the storyline. Through the medium of film, Keta's individual story acquires a symbolic universal meaning and stands for all the exploited and discriminated migrant workers working in unsafe conditions. And I'll leave the floor to Giulia now.
I will tell you the story of belatedness, says Khosravi at the beginning of the film, in which his film as he writes and reads an essay on the current border regime. But Khosravi's intervention has arrived too late. Keta has already started to tell that story. Khosravi's narration has therefore no futurity. It can only function as the gauge measuring the distance between each waiting imposed on Keta's journey. Khosravi materializes through his voice what Keta and the audience cannot see, the political structure of spatial and temporal disbelonging that forces migrants to wait endlessly. But what is the point of having Khosravi discussing this new technology of post-colonial domination? Khosravi is himself a migrant trapped into this waiting game. However, He participated not for the sake of similarity, nor coherence, nor sympathy. In his introduction to On the Post-Colony, significantly titled Time on the Move, Achille Mbembe writes that Africa is the mediation that enables the West to accede to his own subconscious and gives a public account of its subjectivity. Exhausted in its geographical limits and natural resources, the West extracts from Africa its time through the dispossession of existential temporality from migrants. In capitalist society, time is an abstraction. It has no value outside the space of production. It is value only as a form of labor. It exists, says Lefebvre, only in connection to space. To create spaces of waiting means to transform existential time into exploitable resource of capitalist advancement. The willingness to imagine a future, which is the human main drive, materialize around categories of time and space. To enter adulthood entails the security of a stable career path set over a defined arch of time and in place in what one can call a home. Or it is constructed around a timely movement from a point of departure to one of arrival. To delay people in the fulfillment of their life project endangered that same idea of projecting oneself into future and generates precarity. This, though, is not only perceived, but exercised over people as a form of political discipline and control. Postcoloniality, the extension of racial domination and class exploitation beyond the dissolution of the colony as a legitimate spatial configuration, dispossessed people of time as form of cheap labor extraction, as social hierarchization that preserve capitalist inequality. Precarity, the yawning sense of lost opportunities for stability, captures people in an endless waiting that exploits their desires and dreams as time fades away. Precarity is a structure around economic rapacity and the political disinvestment in welfare structure that secure life, such as the schooling and the health system. The dismantling of the system and the attractiveness of rapacious economy produces both movement in and out of West. This is particularly true for places such as Italy, whose policies on labor and immigration are framed around the idea of labor and existential precarity. Here, and to go to Mbembe's work, the extraction of time gives a public account of precarian Western subjectivity. The extraction of time is not yet a contingency of migration, but a general condition of existence. The global pandemic of COVID-19, given the disparities of privileges, has put the whole world in a limbo. As any unprecedented historical event, the global pandemic has hastened and accelerated pre-existing structure of existence. Since March 2020, precarity, both environmental and existential, has left people waiting and longing for stability that, as we wait for it, becomes more and more unattainable, obliterating its futurity. Khrushchev says that keeping people in waiting is a punishment for being a foreigner and for having thus arrived late. To this extent, for him, the long lines of migrants who wait outside the embassies of rich nations in capitals of poor countries, at the borders between European countries and between the US and Mexico, or in refugee camps in Kenya and Jordan, are paradigmatic images of our time. To conclude, today's borders practice steal and exploits migrants' time in continuity with colonial practices that stole and exploited natural and human resources in previous era. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. And sound was fine after that, Valeria, so no problem whatsoever. Thank you again for that presentation. And once more, I can see links here backward and forward, back to what we were talking about in the previous session, for instance, about the question of being in limbo, and forward to some of the presentation that will follow on what COVID has meant for mobility, immobility, time, and space. So to move on swiftly again, our third presentation is by Eleanor Painter. So Eleanor is working at the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University, and she studies displacement asylum and migrant testimony, focusing in particular on Africa, Europe mobilities and the Black Mediterranean in the Italian context. She's working on a book at present, on a book project on emergency in transit. And today she will be talking to us about the relationship between captivity and crisis, focusing precisely on this notion of emergency. Eleanor, your turn.
Thanks so much. Thanks again to the organizers, and yeah, I'm really excited to be in conversation with all of you and with everyone on this panel. Yeah, I agree, lots of resonances already, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to do a screen share. I just have a few images to accompany what I'm saying. Oh, I thought I could. Can you enable it, Matteo? Great, thanks. Okay. Does that look like it should? Okay. I want to think with you today about the relationship between captivity, crisis, and the racial state. And with just 10 minutes, I really mean to offer a few provocations for our discussion as a group. And I could have taken up any of a number of sites, but for this purpose and with just a few minutes, I want to think using the lens of captivity to think about a paradox that's especially resonant in Italy right now, and that's arisen largely because of how crisis as discourses and policies or emergenza we could talk about legitimizes a series of violent racialized bordering practices. So this paradox is that under the guise of emergency response, Italy simultaneously holds migrants, asylum seekers at sea, so holds them captive just outside the nation, while at the same time, Italian asylum officials have denied asylum claims at higher rates, yet not deported most of the people whose claims were denied. So while some migrants are held captive at sea, unable to enter, a growing population of undocumented subjects who are deportable yet not deported is held captive within the country, unable to leave. And in thinking through this paradox, and drawing on reflections from this project that Loredana mentioned, thinking about emergency as both a set of imagined and material realities. So thinking about that relationship between the imagined and the material in the Italian migration landscape. And one of the things that I focus on is how the emergency imaginaries that frame migration in the Italian context, and here you see also how they get drawn out well outside of this context too. So how the discourses of crisis and emergency that have long been used to discuss precarious migration and arrivals by sea, these emergency imaginaries have real material consequences for people on the move. They implicitly legitimize violent and problematic bordering and reception practices. So crisis enables violent forms of exclusion, which in turn racialize precarious migration. Anti-immigrant racism, of course, isn't unique to moments of crisis. Bordering practices consistently enact processes of racialization as they define some groups as alien or illegal and therefore unwelcome. And here I turn to Etienne Balibar's discussion of crisis racism, where he observes that circumstances of crisis bring into stark relief the ways in which racism, quote, is anchored in material structures of very long standing, which are an integral part of what is called national identity. The policies and practices that regulate movement in the Mediterranean Sea and along Italian coasts racialize in legal terms as policies are implicated in the othering and marginalization of foreigners, even when they don't overtly cite race. This is also the case in social terms, for instance, as media representations of asylum seekers rely on visual and verbal languages of exclusion. And in context deemed crisis, the need to resolve emergency situations is used to justify increasingly restrictive policies accompanied by pervasive anti-immigrant sentiment, as has been seen in recent years across Europe. So crisis makes long-standing dynamics more salient, sometimes assuming new forms. So here, tracing the relationship between crisis and captivity through the two examples of the Porti Chiusi campaign and deportability, thinking about both of these as instantiations of captivity. I hope to open up a discussion about the implications of what are fundamentally racialized processes. We're living with the legacy of Matteo Salvini's Porti Chiusi campaign started in June 2018. And I assume that you're familiar with at least the basics of this situation. This campaign prevented NGO-operated ships from entering Italian ports and disembarking rescued migrants. As ships await word of a close and safe port of entry, and as Italy and now other countries, often Malta, hold off on permitting ships in, Porti Chiusi transforms situations of rescue into situations of captivity. And that's not only my reading, that's also now the case that's brought Salvini on trial, where he's been charged with kidnapping for 2 cases in which migrants were held on boats and not allowed to disembark. These standoffs, and this is a term I would love to problematize if we have time, these have potentially traumatic consequences for those on board. If you can imagine having fled detention in Libya and survived the crossing only to be held at sea. They also violate international agreements because they fail to allow the completion of rescue missions, and they interfere with and even inhibit people from claiming asylum. Despite changes in government, uncertainty about rescue continues. Since 2014, asylum officials managed increases in migrant arrivals by alternately stalling or accelerating the review of asylum claims. As a consequence, rather than resolve situations of risk, precarity, or need, the system has held migrants in extended periods of limbo, only to increasingly reject claims and appeals without feasible plans in place to deal with the homeless, stateless subjects these rejections produce. Here I'm thinking especially about what happens at the end of a person's often long wait for status determination, as we've just heard about, while living, for example, in a centro di accoglienza straordinaria or CAS, so the structures that were established in 2014 as part of larger emergency response strategies. Intended to house asylum seekers for 2 to 3 months, they in fact house people for much longer than that, as we've just heard. I think Valeria said up to 1,000 days. I certainly met plenty of people who were there for 2 years or more. And over the course of the crisis, as policy changed concerning forms of protection, and as pressure mounted to determine cases more swiftly, an increasing number of CAS residents were denied papers and therefore had to leave reception. And here you see a couple of representations of the idea of the increased number of undocumented subjects, and also that this was a consequence of policies that eliminated some forms of protection, which I'll talk about now. So the issue here is that the government, well, one issue is that the government doesn't arrange deportation for all those whose claims are denied. So in this sense, the CAS have become a key site of production of illegal or deportable subjects, most of whom come from countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And just to offer one example, a little more specifically, in an interview I conducted at CAS in 2018, a man from West Africa, when describing how he learned his appeal had been rejected, said he had been abbandonato. He later clarified using the more formal term dimesso, but his initial citing of abbandonato speaks to at least 2 readings of his circumstances. He understood both that he had to abandon the CAS and that Italy had, through this rejection, abandoned him. And I want to suggest that this abandonment is a form of captivity, holding people without papers, which limits how they can move and what they can do. As with other statistics on irregular migration, precise numbers are difficult to ascertain, but the low rate of actual deportations compared to the number of denied asylum claims illustrates the significant growth of undocumented populations. For example, in an 8-month period in 2018 and 2019, authorities denied 45,000 asylum applications, but only deported 5,000 people. This is captivity by rejection and by invisibilization. Those who came to Europe hoping to obtain protection become stuck without papers and with limited recourse to aid or to a safe way out of the country. In this new legal limbo, people are effectively invisible to the state and should remain unseen by authorities. So to return to the paradox with which I began, how can we reconcile the state's actions as it actively prevents some people from arriving and simultaneously effectively prevents some from leaving? We can't resolve this paradox through the logics of migration governance alone, unless we acknowledge that those logics of migration governance alone, unless we acknowledge that those logics fundamentally involve racializing processes that hold those deemed to be unwanted others just outside the nation, whether they're physically outside it or in fact within the nation. These tactics of the racial state, that is, the state as formed and maintained through racializing processes, become especially clear in policy itself. For instance, we can look at Salvini's two security decrees from 2018 and 2019, which primarily criminalized independent rescue at sea and were framed around security. These acts perpetuate the idea that immigration is fundamentally a threat to the nation. But in addition to their focus on arrivals, these same legislative acts included citizenship regulations, for instance, stipulating a language exam for naturalization. Linking national security to the arrival of foreigners and to their potential legal belonging suggests that the security concerns they address are not strictly about irregular migration, but about foreignness. That is, preventing those deemed foreign from belonging to the national body. Standoff practices and the production of deportable subjects racialize migrants as dangerous others, targeting Black migrants in particular as suspect and presumptively undeserving, not only of legal protection, but of establishing a life in Italy. I'll close by highlighting quickly, I guess just gesturing to two implications. First, understanding how these dynamics are connected across borderscapes helps us recognize how necropolitics function beyond a crisis that's often framed as unfolding at external borders. So recognizing how these practices enact state power, not only by managing life, but by governing through death and danger. And this has already come up in both of the prior presentations and forms, so I'm interested to talk about links to coloniality as well. And second, these practices also position Italy and the Mediterranean as a critical global site for challenging the right to claim asylum and perhaps dismantling the asylum system itself. And I'd welcome discussing any of these points further with you. Thanks.
Thank you again, and thank you once more for keeping so wonderfully to time. I think we, by being so so efficient, we will have plenty of time at the end for discussion, which I'm sure is going to be really lively. So you've drawn yourself a number of connections between your intervention, Eleanor, and that of others. So let's move on to the next one, which is from Francesca Soliman. Francesca is a PhD student in criminology at the University of Edinburgh in the law school there. And her research looks at social harms caused by borderization. So again, this notion of border and borderization, which is returning here. In particular, she focuses on the impact of borderization on border communities at the external margins of the EU and on the emerging discipline of semiology, or the study of social harm, as I was mentioning earlier. And today her contribution will focus on findings from an ethnography she carried out on the island of Lampedusa. So Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Loredana. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I have multiple monitors as well, which are just making it even more complicated than it needs to be. Is this working? Can you see my screen? I can't see you anymore, so I'm going to need a yes or no.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Lovely. So I'll start my kitchen timer then to keep the time. So as Loredana said, my background is in criminology, but what I focus on is not crime, is social harms, and I look at the social harms of borderization. So by borderization here, I mean the processes through which a border comes to be enforced, whether it's through militarization or other infrastructures, for the purpose of controlling the irregular movement of people. Borderization, as you all know, is not an accident of geography, but a deliberate process, which serve national or supranational objectives which are not necessarily aligned with the interests of local communities. So mine is a case study on the small island of Lampedusa, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. It sits in the middle of the central Mediterranean migration route, which is known as the most dangerous migrant route in the world due to the high lethality of the crossing. What I discussed today is a collateral finding from my ethnography, like something I did not set out to study, but that emerged during my time there. And I'm taking the opportunity today to discuss it with you because it's one of the issues I've had a lot of difficulties trying to make sense of. So I'm sure I'm with the right people today to try and make more sense out of it. So my study looks at how borderization has impacted on the Lampedusa's community. And in particular today, I'd like to talk about how borderization impacts the community's perception of the migrants who transit for Lampedusa and how this interacts with residents' self-perception and their perception of Lampedusa as a place that has this high profile in media, political and academic discourse as a place of hospitality and solidarity. So for a bit of context, before borderization, so about up to 30, 40 years ago, migrants who arrive into Lampedusa would normally be welcomed by the local population who would feed them and give any first aid that was necessary and usually gather the money for them to travel onwards to Italy. That is not possible anymore. This unconditional hospitality that was offered in pre-border times has now been institutionalized and integrated with securitization and border control. So today, Lampedusa is an outpost of the European Union's external border. It hosts a large presence of law enforcement, army, navy, Frontex, humanitarian organizations, etc. So migrants who arrive in Lampedusa are meant to are housed in the what is now called the hotspot, which you see in this picture here, and they're meant to be swiftly transferred to the mainland following identification and the taking of fingerprints. But in reality, the stay often stretches into weeks or months. So residents come into contact with migrants, usually in the streets of the island, as after about 48 hours have passed, if the migrants are still in the hotspot, then authorities will turn a blind eye to them exiting through a hole in the net and will allow them to walk around the island. And this is particularly the case when there are arrivals from the north of Africa who are more likely to be repatriated, so are kept waiting on Lampedusa. So this turns the island into effectively an open-air prison for migrants and in some ways for residents. And I guess, Eleanor, when you were talking about captivity as a response to crisis, this is what it reminded me of. When there's moments of crisis or excessive flux, that's what happens. The whole island is shut and everybody who's in it becomes captive. So it's important to note that while the media often presents Lampedusa as kind of a barometer of wider public attitudes towards migration, transit spaces like this have a different experience of migration compared to mainland Italy or Europe. So issues such as integration, for instance, are completely irrelevant to the island's reality because the migrant stay, even if it gets longer than it needs to be, is temporary. And the two communities largely occupy different spaces, even though they interact in the streets, and then the migrants will enter the hotspot again at night. And the migrants will not really have money to patronize the local shops and bars. So the two existences are largely separated. And in the same way, arguments about the benefits of migration, such as economic or cultural contribution made to receiving societies, have no local relevance for Lampedusa. So talking to residents, I found that they still mostly saw Lampedusa as a space of hospitality, which was fulfilling a humanitarian role. But this hospitality was now considered conditional, something that needed to be deserved. And interestingly, this view was shared both by those residents who identified themselves as being opposed to the migrants' presence on the island or opposed to migration in general, and by those who identified as supporters of migrants, whether by taking part in informal support networks or working with local NGOs or doing other types of solidarity work. So residents made the distinction among migrants dividing them into two main groups. One was Tunisians, which actually was a proxy term for all arrivals from the north of Africa, and who normally would be departing the Tunisian coast. And Sub-Saharans, which actually normally just meant East Africans, but was kind of a proxy term for all African migrants arriving from the Libyan coast, generally speaking. So those who oppose migrants present describe North Africans as inherently criminal, and while viewing Sub-Saharan migrants as in real need of help and deserving of some sort of hospitality. Like this quote here from one of my respondents says, many people are shocked when you mention differences among the arrival. There are people running away from wars, coming in peace, but others are delinquent before they even get off the boat. And stating that when sub-Saharans arrive, they do not cause any public order issue. So the idea here is that all migrants are criminal, but some subcategories, such as sub-Saharans, are, because they are deserving victims in need of help, can be seen as the exception. And this was strangely similar to the views expressed by those who were openly in support of migrants. So they did not say that North Africans were intrinsically criminal. Nobody expressed that view or supported that view. But at the same time, they still reserve a label of victims for sub-Saharans and viewed North Africans as an unwelcome presence on the island. So, as you can see from this quote here from a humanitarian worker, the presence of Tunisians was seen as an obstacle to the realization of humanitarian objectives. So because North Africans were more likely to be repatriated, and they did not need the same type of medical help as migrants who arrived from Libya, they didn't need support to navigate the asylum system, as they were very unlikely to be able to even make asylum applications. They didn't need help integrating. So local support organizations felt useless and redundant when Tunisians were around. And there's an interesting point here being made about Lampedusa becoming a holiday resort for Tunisians. And this opinion that the presence of Tunisians is the reason why authorities do not bring sub-Saharan migrants to Lampedusa anymore, or did not at that point, which was 2018. Because the idea was that Tunisians are racist and therefore that would be harmful to the sub-Saharans. So in this way, even though North Africans are not viewed as inherently bad or delinquent, but there is something about their lack of a victim status that is an obstruction to local supporters being able to support who they see as real victims. So this is how the dichotomy kind of presented. So North Africans were described as being just strong, young, single men who were delinquent, described by some, who were described as being cocky and protesting a lot and making requests, and they looked healthy, so not in need of help, whereas sub-Saharan Africans were described as coming with families or with children and escaping war and famine. And the behavior was described a lot as being meek, as being embarrassed, and this demeanor seemed to be very important for residents and in need of charity. And also, especially those who arrived from Libya, would be visibly exhausted, injured, starved by the long trip, and maybe will have visible signs of torture as well. So these characteristics, being weak, vulnerable, passive, dependent, and grotesque, they are very well fit with the ideal victim in international law as described by Schwebel-Patel. Except that the only difference here is that residents who are hostile to migration, seem to privilege the first three characteristics, whereas residents who were more supportive privileged the other two in ideal victims. And this is because these characteristics describe not just the people, but the relationship that they could have with them, reinforce the usefulness of humanitarian workers and their own role as saviors. So since Lampedusans were not privy to the nationality of arrival, this division between deserving and not deserving migrants was largely made on sight, and to be precise, it was made on skin color. So with darker skin was marking those more deserving of hospitality. I'm going to need one more minute and then I'm done. So this is strangely inconsistent with what we will find elsewhere. So research in Italy shows over and over that the pay and treatment of migrant workers tends to get worse the darker the skin color. So I consider some possible explanations for this strangely reversed racialized hierarchy of victimhood. I thought perhaps there was some perceived similarity due to Italy's colonial past in the east of Africa, but while these shared pasts were remembered in their former colonies, such as Ethiopia and Eritrea, or by the African Italians who migrated in the 40s, as Antonio was mentioning earlier. In fact, this past has all but disappeared from Italians' historical memory, and indeed it was never mentioned in Lampedusa. So I suggest that this racialized hierarchy of victimhood even though it seems to overturn more common patterns of discrimination, in it, there's a victim-savior dynamic that still assigns dark-skinned migrants a subordinate position compared to residents. The paternalistic views of helpless and passive sub-Saharans expressed by the residents was just a continuation of colonial time racial stratification, with East Africans filling a new old role as passive colonial subjects in need of help. So I suggest finally that the support for refugees did not signify a lack of bias, nor did it challenge racist foundations that were also underpinning anti-migrant sentiment. If anything, it reinforced the idea of solidarity as an exceptional gift to be bestowed only in cases of emergency and crisis. So this is an inclusion which relies on the perpetuation of exclusion, in this case, the exclusion of North African. And I conclude with this quote, which I wish I had collected, but actually it's in a book by Italian anthropologist Marco Aime, and it quotes the island, Lampedusa's priest, talking about a young Tunisian man who committed suicide on Lampedusa at the end of 2017 after being left on the island by authorities for over 3 months. So he was a victim of the violence of waiting that Valeria was mentioning earlier. During my stay, he was never mentioned by anyone, and as Don Carmelo, the priest, says, he was not Black enough to be a victim, and he was not white enough to be someone who could be a savior, who could have that kind of usefulness. So his death had no place in the overarching narrative of victims and saviors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. And again, we can see a number of connections here with other papers that we've heard, or other interventions that we've heard. And I think we will have, again, a lot to chew over, and you also invited us to help perhaps interpret or explain some of the findings that you just illustrated for us. But to conclude, and last but not least, let's move on to our last intervention in the roundtable, which is from Maddalena Tirabassi. And Maddalena, I'm sure, needs no introduction, but she is the director, but as the rhetoric requires, having said that she needs no introduction, I will give you an introduction, of course. So she is the director of the Altre Italie Center on Italian Migrations, Globus et Locus. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Altre Italie, and is also past vice president of the Association of European Migration Institutions. She has published a number of books, too many to mention, and I'm sure many of us have read a number of them, some on her own, some in recent years, especially with Alvise Del Pera, who's another colleague at the center. And today she's going to move us. Well, we've been hearing about migration mostly towards Italy. We've been hearing about Italians as bearers of memory, or on the other hand, the lack of memory that they display. We've heard now in Francesca's paper about Italians and their position with respect to hospitality. Now Maddalena is going to take us to a different perspective yet again, which is the one of testimonies that she and Alvise gathered in a recent volume, Il mondo si allontana, il Covid-19 e le nuove migrazioni italiane, which was looking at contemporary Italian migrants and the impact that the COVID pandemic had on their lives in the first few months, March to July of 2020. Maddalena, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and hello to everybody. And I will talk about Italian migrants, contemporary Italian migrants, and the COVID impact on their lives. But first, I would like to speak a little bit about physical exclusion suffered by Italians in their history of migration, starting from the ethnic ghettos in the late 19th, early 20th century, whose borders many migrants, especially women, never dare to pass. During World War II, more than 500,000 Italian citizens living in the United States had to register as enemy aliens. Thousands were forced to resettle, and a small number were interned. In the 60s, we had the Refugee Collection Center of the Giuliano-Dalmati diaspora, not to speak of Italian children in Switzerland hidden in closets because illegal in the country. Today, I will speak of a captivity imposed not by political constraints, but by the pandemic. The pandemic hit a generation of migrants quite different from the past. In general, these migrants had not met discrimination on any constriction. They were educated, usually welcomed in school, university, and workplaces. In Europe, since 1985, they enjoyed freedom of movement due to the Schengen Treaty that established freedom of movement within European borders. They were accustomed to a student exchange, and they used to travel frequently also across the ocean thanks to low-cost fares. And forgive my schematism of this, but I think it's important to see the contrast the pandemic made. This presentation is based on the testimonies gathered in Mondo Si Allontana on the impact COVID pandemic had on their lives during the first phase of the pandemic crisis. The inquiry was online for 2 months, and we had 1,200 answers from 57 different countries. 54% of the respondents were between 30 and 39 years old. The majority was women, and the majority of them had been abroad more than 3 years. This is important because we got just a sample of an elite among the Italian migrants. The majority of them was registered to the IRE, so that's meaningful too. With the pandemic, everything changed in the lives of Italian expats. Many experienced the lockdown in small shared apartments, and those who were in faraway countries were not able to return to Italy. At first, their main concern regarded their families in Italy and their inability to reach and assist them. Then they started to worry also for the lack of contacts to keep transnational families ties, as many of the testimonies we collected in the inquiry has shown. In July, 80% of the respondents had not returned to Italy. 13 returned at the end of the first Italian lockdown. And I would like to read now some of the reaction these migrants had to the pandemic. The first one by Alessandro Mastrototaro, born in Turin in '94, with a doctorate, and went to the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. At the beginning of the pandemic, he had just arrived in Sweden and decided to stay there at the cost of complete isolation, because he had to he had not had time to know anyone, to meet anyone. And he said, I was in Stockholm and I was planning to return to Italy for a week. As soon as I arrived, a bit overwhelmed by nostalgia, I looked for flights to Italy, knowing that I could work from home. At first, it was difficult to understand what was happening. Then I started to worry when the first deaths started coming out. I canceled the flight I had in early March. I began to get stressed more and more. On the other hand, there were those who took the opposite way. Another respondent to the inquiry, intending to settle in England before the Brexit, he left for London at the beginning of March, and he was locked up until the end of June. In order to visit home in the whole year, he and his American wife who had to take 5 quarantine and lockdown. Another testimony by another Piedmontese young man. he used to return to Italy from London just before the pandemic began. He told us I had booked 10, 11 return flights to give an idea of the mobility which was working within, at least within Europe. Sometimes in intra-European migration, there is in fact a sort of commuting, as in the case of another young man whose wife said before the lockdown, he was in Hungary. Before the lockdown, he used to commute to Italy with the returns every 2 weeks. Another testimony from a woman who worked in Germany for the European Central Bank. She said that it also depends on the weather. Even 3 or 4 times, we are emigrants, sui generis, expats. We can afford it. And when my mother got sick, I also went back every weekend. Another testimony. Pre-coronavirus, I went every week from March to June and every other week the rest of the year. The weather is very important for commuting. There are others who have transnational families. This one, I'm in Zurich to be next to my partner and with my 2 daughters, 2 or 3 days a week, almost every week. Since February, I have not returned to Italy. If I had, I would not have been able to return to Switzerland until June 16. The epidemic forced me for the first time to choose between Switzerland and Italy. Even in the antipodes migration, transnational family ties were maintained through frequent visits home. Simone Battistoni, university professor in Melbourne, he said that he was coming to Italy once or twice a year. The answer to the question we posed on if and why the coronavirus experience had changed the idea of living abroad gave an idea of the change the pandemic had brought. First testimony. I don't want to live so far from home without the possibility of being able to return except in an emergency. I felt and still do isolated without a community of reference and without a family. Another, my partner lives and works in Italy. We used to move often between Italy and Germany. With the closure of the borders and the different management of the emergency, we realized the difficulty of continuing in this situation for a long time. The distance could have been bridged before, but now I have realized that if there are no flights, you cannot be closer to the family. Another, because traveling and returning to Italy will be increasingly expensive and more difficult. I was scared of not being able to return. Another, living on the other side of the world is not a problem as long as you are free to return to Italy at any time. When this freedom is taken away, the conditions change. Because for the first time, I felt unable to return to my family in case of need. Another, I would not continue to live abroad if I did not have the opportunity to travel regularly to Italy and visit my family. I felt too caged without being able to go home when I wanted freely. Suddenly, connectivity and the possibility of returning to Italy were blocked, and this scared us. Another, I arrived a month before the outbreak. The emergency was not treated properly. I'm still in voluntary lockdown after 4 months. For the first time, I truly felt away from home and my family. I felt really alone. We go to the conclusion. These are just few testimonies of the sense of constraint and isolation brought by the pandemic to Italian migrants of the 3rd millennium. And I just spoke of the elite, the invisible, who tell a more complicated story. But I think I have to stop. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddalena. That's splendid. And again, you've opened up a whole series of other perspectives, which I think we will need to face, which also have to do with our assumptions about who and what is Italian there, and again, the visibility and invisibility of different categories. Now, I'm looking at Elena and Matteo. If you're happy with this, I would like to, first of all, thank again all of our speakers and also for keeping so wonderfully to time. And then I would say, so we're at 2 o'clock. Our session is meant to close at 2:15. Can you give us a steer as to whether we can have a few extra minutes or not, and that will sort of influence how we move from here. So can you give us a little steer on that?
Yeah, well, as far as I'm concerned, we can carry on as long as we need. So
right, so let's say we have at least 20 minutes so that
absolutely.
people don't feel this anxiety. And
no.
Yeah, I will be very quick in my, I was asked to respond, and there is so much to take on board, of course, here. So I'll try to draw a few things from what I have heard, draw together a few things, but then very much wanting to offer a couple of provocations of my own and open up questions here. I think the first thing that I would note is that so much of what we heard, of course, is about the time and the space of the nation. What are the assumptions also that we ourselves make and continue to make about what is Italy, the time in which Italy exists, how its memory, its present, its past, its future work, and also who is Italian and who isn't Italian, and what we can assume about Italians. This is something that comes up again and again. It comes through in questions of colonial and post-colonial memory. It comes through in the attitude towards immigration towards Italy. It comes through in what Maddalena was just saying about the nature, for instance, of transnational families. I'm often struck by the way in which, at the heart of discourses about Italy and about Italian diasporic cultures, but also about the culture of hospitality or inhospitality that we see today in Italy, there remain certain assumptions. Let me give you a provocation of my own, as I said. If I think about it in the context of what I'm doing at present, what I'm teaching here at Stony Brook, I'm discussing notions of Italian Americanness with my students, and it's really interesting to see how, for instance, the whole discourse about whether Italians, Matteo knows more than me about this, but the whole discourse about whether Italians are positioned in the States as white or not so white is posited on the assumption that, that's the discourse about Italian Americans, but it's posited on the assumptions that by definition, Italians are white. And somehow this returns in what we've been discussing today. Whilst the evidence, of course, from what Maddalena was saying is that there are so many transnational families, families which are transnational in space, they are transnational in their identity, they are transnational in their belonging in the reality of Italy today. But also that question that was being posed by Francesca about who is a victim and who isn't a victim, how we can see the migrant or how the migrant is perceived. Again, markers of difference where there somehow, if Italy is white by definition, I'm asking you as a provocation again, does that mean that Africa, that collective Africa, has to be homogeneously black? So there are assumptions here that I think we need to reckon with. And then there's the question of time. The image that keeps cropping into my mind is, of course, Walter Benjamin's image of the angel of history, blown into the future, looking backwards. And memory works that way. So here we have this ghostliness, this return or lack of return of memory, of colonial memory, of post-colonial memory. In the case of Italy, of memory of Italy's own racial prejudice and of its own migration history and so on. But at the same time, what I think we need to continue to remember, and what some of the quotations that we heard here told us, is that when we're talking about memory, we're not just talking about the past, we're talking about the future. We're talking about how also the traumas of the past are reflected into our ability to not just stay with those imaginaries, but somehow imagine a different future, perhaps, and how that future is made of the memory of those traumas, but is made so much also about desires. I was struck by that, the notion of, you know, the letters to the son, where the question is, do I desire a future like this for my son or not? Do I desire for you the reality in which I'm living or not? So that projection into the future, which I think we need to keep in mind as well. So I want to underline these things, and then the questions of language. For instance, the question of whether we talk about legality and illegality, and what the import of such labels is. So I'll leave you with those three things: the question of labels, the question of time and its projection into the future, and the question of the racialization, not only of the perception of migrants, but also of how that relates to the racialization of Italians themselves and our assumptions about that. I'll stop there. I think I've said enough, probably even too much, and obviously we're welcoming questions, comments, interventions from anyone in the group at present. And you can just jump in or raise your hand, whichever you prefer.
Might I jump in and raise
Francesca,
my physical hand?
Yes. Yeah, raise your physical hand. It's easier. The other hand, sometimes it's only in the chat, it gets complicated.
It takes me ages to find the right button, and it's usually always a second, third attempt. Jess, I wanted to weigh in. You asked a question about race and, you know, is Italy white? And I'm going to answer with an answer that's going to raise more questions, I think. So when I was in Lampedusa, and there were many North African migrants walking through the town, and they were always pointed out to me by residents. To me, they were virtually undistinguishable from the residents of Lampedusa because of the skin color, because of the features, and then I started recognizing them because of their clothes, because they will be given clothes inside the detention center. And another, so I was wondering, where is this big difference between the Italians and the North African? Perhaps is it cultural, but then other residents will talk about visiting Tunisia and feeling like it was just a big Lampedusa, because Lampedusa is, for people who have visited a small island like that, it doesn't have traffic lights, it doesn't have a lot of the hustle and bustle of a big city. So Lampedusa will tell me of being disoriented when they went to Sicily, to Palermo or Catania, these big cities. They didn't feel like home, but Tunisia was much more similar. So there are cultural similarities as well with the north of Africa. So that just raised even more questions for me. So why was perhaps some of this hostility towards the North African came not from a perceived difference, but too much similarity in one way. So the idea of who deserves help, who needs help. So the idea that people who will come through the sea, they were too similar to the residents. And then we're like, well, why would you deserve to be helped? And I do not see myself in your place, so I would not receive this help. So there was a process of racialization of Tunisians as not white enough, which was actually kind of distinct from race itself, from actual skin color, from actual features, from cultural differences or similarities. So I feel like there was a precise othering of North Africans that was made by the locals. And again, it's a specific population with specific circumstances I talk about. I'm not generalizing to the whole of Italy. But that othering was necessary to maintain their own identity and also maintain some sort of superiority in the hierarchy. Like Don Carmelo said, Tunisians are not white enough, because even though they look the same and behave the same, they are in a position of inferiority because they are the ones who had to cross the sea, and they're coming to us asking for things. So there are different processes there. And one last thing I wanted to add was that this idea of these negative perceptions of North Africans were not constant. Sometimes, like for example, the ones that had been there in the winter of 2017 were described as these terrible criminals. But at the same time, people will tell me about the Tunisians who were on Lampedusa in 2011 following the so-called Arab Spring. And at some point, there were 11,000 Tunisians on the island for an island of only 6,000 residents. And I know from the media, there were lots of disorders. There was, it was quite a tense situation. There were episodes of vandalism. There were episodes of violence, but that was completely forgotten by residents. Residents would talk about it very positively. They will deny that there were any disorders. But they will put a lot of emphasis on the fact that the migrants there, the state was absent, so the migrants needed their help. So by needing the help of the locals, and then they gave again the locals back their identity as saviors, as someone who can bestow hospitality. And so they went back, they got their victimhood back, even though they were North Africans and not the ideal victims. So these are all circumstantial things. And I feel like the racialization process is very historically contingent, to the point that even the memory of residents might sometimes be posthumously modified to kind of fit in the circle. So this didn't answer your question at all, but I'm hoping to just add,
it raises more questions about the anxieties, the kind of racial anxieties that are imprinted into these phenomena. And again, without wanting to generalize, of course, it raises questions about, of course, the other notion that can be used in these contexts is the notion of passing. So the anxiety, precisely, that need to demarcate. We're talking about bordering here. Bordering is physical bordering, is geographical bordering, but we're talking also about bordering in terms of identification. How can we demarcate a border between us and other than us? And the interesting thing is here also, I was thinking about the work of Anne-Marie Fortier, who talks about the citizenization that happens with migrants, and the way in which those questions about who is a deserving migrant, how we can easily slip between, into moral judgments. And so that slipping into moral judgments, which of course, again, it's sort of Uncle Tom syndrome. Who is the good slave? Who is the good migrant? How do you have to behave to fit into that category? So again, I think a lot of these anxieties are present in not just in your intervention, but in many of the interventions we were talking about. But others may want to come in to this.
Maybe.
Yeah, Maddalena.
I get into this conversation because I think it's what struck me when we made the inquiries, we had a question about, did you feel discriminated because you were Italian abroad during the COVID? And what came out was kind of interesting, because there was no feeling of discrimination in people who were in Germany. Mm-hmm. And what came out was that Germans love Italy. And Italians were very well treated. Italians were much more discriminated when they were in Eastern countries. The thing is that competition on the labor market make people discriminate. What comes out in Italian-American history, for instance, or in Italian history too, when it's a kind of class, if you belong to the same class, you might be more discriminated because of the fear of losing your job because of the immigrants. So I think it's not a color scheme. One of the great migration historians, Rudolf Vekoli, did a study or did a speech at the conference on how Swedish were discriminated. The white Swedish, they were discriminated. And so they were not black or not, that they were poor at the time of the Great Migration.
Which
and so they were reflect of the victim of the
Which sort of sends us to something that Julia and Valeria were talking about, which is the question of labor and resource extraction, and the way in which a lot of the phenomena that we're looking at, and also that stealing of time, is part of a pattern of of exploitation and resource extraction. I don't know if you want to come into that, Valeria and Julia.
Julia, would you like to go first?
Yes. I think what was really key, to give you a little bit of the background, when we started working on this project, we were experienced this same time of, with same experience that we heard of in the inquiry. We were stuck. I was personally stuck in Paris, and Valeria was stuck first in New York, and then we flew back. We had to flew back to Italy, and we were stuck there. And we experienced directly this idea of being exploited of our own time and not knowing where to go, and still be forced to keep working on our dissertation, on our papers. The workload exponentially expanded than decreasing, and that of course had an impact on us, on our work, on our perception of time, on our perception of mobility, not being able to make our own decision where to be, when to be with our families or not. And the interesting things is that what we start thinking of that because Dagmawi, the director of the short movie that we worked on, and we also post the link in the chat for you if you want to give a glance.
Yes, thank you, by the way, for sharing the link. I forgot to say that earlier.
It's hard to talk about a movie that you cannot see, but we hope that we'll be able to see that afterwards. And it was Dagmawi that asked us, like first time we met, we just saw the movie and we started talking with him, and he said, so how do you feel? And we were like, about what? About the fact that now you're stuck and you're experiencing the same kind of waiting that's been imposed on the lives of migrants for so long. And I think what is very interesting in thinking of time and the use of time you're making right now is this hierarchization of who's exploited of the time and what does that entails, but how that affects society in general. What's the point of living like migrants waiting at the doors of Europe or the US or of Mexico? And that gave us the chance to think of precarity as we said, and we wrote as condition of existence. I think that's really key in understanding how we move through time and space right now. And I think that this can help us of thinking the idea of migrants in general and citizenship and belonging to times and space. And I think that was provocative for us.
Valeria, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just quickly that what was interesting in our conversation with Maui was the fact that what he was telling us and what we then saw in this short film was the fact that we started thinking that this precarity is something that is shared among migrants and non-migrants. And so it's a way for us to think about migration or about migrants not as something, you know, a state of exception or something that it's put migrants in a sort of exceptional exclusion, but we thought of you know, global capitalism or neoliberalist policies is something that is creating these shared conditions of extraction of time that is that allows us to think about these global forces in a way that can give us a sense of also how this extraction of time creates inequality, or vice versa, how inequality allows this situation in which many groups are being more severely impacted by phenomena like, for example, now we're seeing how the COVID-19 pandemic has has impacted people in categories, groups in different ways, and that inequality and precarity are feeding this situation.
Thank you. And I keep thinking of, again, Karen Kaplan's work and a book of hers on trouble, in which she opened with the statement of the assumption, as an American citizen, of course, the assumption, she talked about the assumption of all Americans who take it for granted that they have a right to travel, invade and invest in any place around the world. And again, you know, how that is hierarchized. I have shared, by the way, in the chat, the link to the website of a friend and colleague whom some people may know already, Danilo Balducci, who's worked extensively in Africa. He's a photographer, but also has recently worked on the Balkan route towards Europe, and whose work is insistently about this question of the stealing of time and these places of stasis, this bordering, which is also about a time in limbo. So I thought of his work as we were talking. There are lots of questions that we may want to talk about here, again, to do with memory. We haven't gone back to colonial memory. Antonio, I should say, by the way, one thing that came to mind, I so regret, you know, when you sometimes don't, you think about missed opportunities. A few years ago, and I think it must have been 2014, and you know, in the middle of the Libyan crisis, I was in Venice, and I picked up a copy of La Repubblica, which had the local pages from Venice. And on the front page of that, there was an article on Italy's policies and how they were collaborating and developing collaboration on the issue of Libya with Libya at that point. And the article had been titled Pacificare la Libia, with no sense of memory. You know, I keep thinking maybe it wasn't even the journalist, maybe it was the title maker, but whoever had picked that up had clearly thought, oh, that sounds good, okay? But there was no sense of memory of what Pacificare la Libia is in Italian history, of course, and, you know, Graziani and all the rest.
Yes, absolutely. I think that also another very relevant history is related to the Memoriale of Graziani, was inaugurated in Affile. No, is another point that is revealing very well the issue of the memory. But also, if you look at the 1911, when the Italy was actively participating to the NATO operation in Libya, it was also the anniversary of the colonial war in Libya. So there is a lot of, in reality, there is a lot of connection. And I think that if you look at the history, and I take just a few minutes to add one point to my previous presentation. If you look at the history, I think that one point that is revealing the absurdity of the national identity, I am very provocative, but could be, is the level of the personal relation between people. For example, mixed relations are revealing that these categories of identities, Africans and Italians, as you previously said, is something that in reality is not really existing. It's something that is constructed, is built, and who are really African, who are really Italian? This is the question. When I was in Libya, I was able to record the life story of one of these former Huskaris that was living in Italy during the Second World War, and then he returned to Libya, and I was able to record this story just few years before he passed away. So he was telling me that when he was residing in Sicily and then in Naples, he was not detected as a Libyan, because he was speaking Italian. He was living with an Italian lady, and so was completely in reality on the same level of Italians for the ordinary people. But of course, from the Italian institutions, yes, he's still a colonial subject and then a foreigner. And I think that this point of the Italianness of the colonial subject is something that even today is something that is not completely well recognized, even from an historiographical point of view.
Yes, I'm thinking on this coming Wednesday, I'll be interviewing Shireen Ramzani Fazel for an event here at Stony Brook, and of course she started writing precisely from that position, you know, the forgotten colonial subject who's saying, you know, wait a minute, I exist and you should know about me rather than not know about me. So that issue of the self-perception of the two sides of this story is very much part of that. I'm conscious that Eleanor has not had a further say here. I would like to invite her to come in if she's got any comments, but I'm also conscious that we're getting towards 2:30. So maybe Eleanor, if you want to add anything to our discussion, and then I could hand it back to Elena and to Matteo, unless someone has very urgent comments to make.
Thanks. I guess at this point, I'll just add a couple of quick thoughts. We've covered so much ground. I would just underscore that we've been talking about race in terms of processes of racialization, and I think that's really important. So you asked a question about, is Italy white, are Italians white? And I think maybe a modification I would make, or a switch in direction I would make with that kind of question, is to ask how the construction of Italy as a white or homogenous nation relies on constructions of otherness that change over time. And I think using that as a model gives us a lot of insight into the production and reproduction of race and racialized identities, both culturally and socially, but also in the ways that they're then written into law. And we haven't talked yet about terms, and so I'll just say something quick because you also brought up the question of legality and illegality. And I think it's really important in contexts of migration, where legal status is always a fundamental question, to ask how the terms we use might be reproducing the gaze of the state, and what other terms we can turn to, or what other gazes, different terms might help us use, adopt, see, to understand these experiences differently and to challenge the violent consequences of the state gaze. I'll just leave it there since we're short on time.
Yes, thank you. And yes, absolutely. Thanks for clarifying that for me, in a sense. Yeah, I was talking obviously of racialization, not of race as a racial category, and absolutely. But you're absolutely correct. It's that construction and constant reconstruction of that gaze. And on the question of terminology, what was also at the back of my mind is last week I was marking a whole set of assignment from students here who had visited as a group, online, of course, the 10-Minute Museum in New York. And a number of them, in talking about the histories of migration they had heard, kept using the word illegal migrants. And I had to keep correcting it back to what the museum chooses to use, which is undocumented migrants. And again, you know, this issue of the language that we use that immediately switches gaze and switches parameters. And it was interesting that they had heard undocumented throughout 1 hour of talk, but so many of them wrote illegal when it came to their account. And so that dominance was really interesting to me. Matteo, Elena, I think I'll leave it at this and hand it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Loredana, and all the speakers for what I expected to be. It turned out to be actually a fantastic discussion, and we indeed should have another day to devote to you know, at least develop it further. If I am allowed to say something just before we formally conclude the conference as well, it's just an idea, but it's something that has come out quite often in my works on, as Loredana said, on Italian whiteness / blackness in the US. It's which is resurfacing somehow in Maddalena and Alvise's book, and in Francesca's experiences in Lampedusa. But overall, I think it's an overarching issue, and it's something that Loredana mentioned, which is the idea of hospitality and inhospitality of a land, which is another parameter that we often overlook. But is also interesting. It would be also interesting, probably would be a good theme for another conference, to look at together with the idea of racialization, because the matter of how hospitable a land is compared to the workforce, the migrants who are, going there, visiting, or, exploring somehow. It's something that has always been there, since the beginning of time, probably. And it's to me, it was striking when I read Maddalena's book, that this idea of not being welcome in a land that has become that was regarded as hospitable, but all of a sudden becomes inhospitable, made me think that this is something we should probably look at quite closely. Thinking of what Loredana was saying about the angel of history as well. This idea, probably we lost focus a bit on this concept, on how a land becomes hospitable, when it starts to become inhospitable, because this affects, of course, the people and the migrants in this case, but it could be the workers, as in in modern times. So this is something that I thought it could be a common denominator somehow for all these experiences that we discussed that you discussed in the Roundtable. But it's just an idea. It came to my mind, because there was an article on the Italians of Louisiana that is titled. It was a PhD thesis actually in the beginning, an inhospitable land. That was how Louisiana was seen by Italy. Now that Italy is seen as an inhospitable land by someone else, it makes for an interesting comparison, thinking about the way in which otherness is constructed and all that. But that was just my afterthought, or thought or afterthought. Yeah, so it was a brilliant discussion. Elena, do you want to?
Yeah, and thank you so much for staying up to, it's 2:35 right now. So thank you very much for sticking with us till the very end of the conversation. It was a great pleasure to touch upon so many issues that we hope to continue to discuss in the future with a research group. So we will reach out to you if you ask to our SVP, the conference, or to the speakers, or to other people you may know, and you may tell about what we've been doing during these past 2 days. It was very exciting, and we thank you all very much, and we'll reach out to you very soon, right, Matteo, and to continue our conversation. Francesca.
A very quick question. Are you thinking of making the recordings available anytime soon? I'm asking because I think this discussion would be very useful if I could use it for my final year course that covers the second half, the history of Italy. So I think that would be something. So if everybody is in agreement, and if you, I don't know what sort of legal steps one has to take, but I'd be delighted to use the conversation for my students. As the chapter that I covered is.
Yes, Francesca, we are indeed, and we created a YouTube channel. Of course, we'll ask permission to everybody who appeared on screen, but we, before recording, we asked the rhetorical.
No, I meant the time frame. Would you think it'd be going to be ready in a week, 10 days, 3 months? A
little bit of time to edit it, but I would say within the next 10 days at the most, right?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Because, yeah, we can.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, actually. So yes, you can go back or to some of these presentations and these discussions, yes. And of course, we hope to also put together an edited volume in the future with these or some of these contributions or other contributions by creating this working group. So it's almost 2:40 now, so I'll let you go because I know that in Europe is already pretty late and here it's the middle of the afternoon according to where we are on the East Central or Western time. But thank you again to everybody. It's been a great pleasure and we hope to continue these conversations with all of you. Thank you. Grazie mille a tutti. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again. Bye bye. Ciao ciao. Grazie a tutti.
Grazie.
Grazie mille.
Grazie
Matteo,
Grazie.
Ciao.
Ciao. Grazie, buona serata.
Ciao a tutti.
Grazie.
Ci sentiamo tutti.
Ciao, ciao.
Grazie.
Ciao.
Quindi non c'è l'after party, io speravo in un after party, invece niente.